The moment the kettle began to rattle on the old gas stove, steam fogging the cracked pane above the sink, Mara realized she had exactly $1 left in the whole world and 47 seconds before the mail truck rounded Maple Street. She pressed the coin to her lips the way children do when they're making wishes on fountains, and the metal tasted like the last sip of yesterday's coffee. Outside, the Cedar Falls morning smelled of wet cedar after the rain, and somewhere down the block, Mrs. Jenkins's wind chimes tinkled like a warning bell. Mara's fingers trembled around the coin. The rent was due, the fridge was empty, and her grandmother's antique locket, the one thing she'd sworn never to sell, sat accusingly on the counter. 41 seconds now. She could still dash out and buy the single stamp she needed to mail the pawn ticket, or she could… What? She didn't know yet. The kettle screamed. She didn't move. She slipped the dollar into her coat pocket anyway, stepped onto the porch, and the screen door groaned behind her like a worried elder. The air was cool enough to sting her cheeks, but warm enough to promise spring was stubbornly arriving. Down the street, the neon open sign flickered at Dot's Diner where the Tuesday special was still 2 eggs, hash browns, and coffee for $3.99. Mara used to meet her mother there every birthday. Now, Dot's felt like a museum of happier times. She walked faster, boots splashing through puddles that reflected a sky the color of old nickels. 30 seconds. The mail truck's engine coughed around the corner, and then she saw him. He was sitting on the curb outside the post office, coat too thin for the chill, holding a cardboard sign that simply read, "Trying to get home." His hands shook. Not dramatically, just the way a leaf trembles before it falls. Mara's footsteps slowed. 22 seconds. The mail truck's brakes squeaked. She was still 3 houses away. The man looked up. His eyes were the same, storm gray as the sky, and for a heartbeat, they simply held each other's gaze. No plea, no words. Just a shared understanding that sometimes the world is too heavy to carry alone. Mara's fingers found the dollar in her pocket again. It felt heavier than it had any right to be. She took the final steps, crouched, and pressed the coin into his palm. "Buy something warm," she whispered. The man's eyes widened, not surprise, more like recognition of something he'd lost. He opened his mouth, but the mail truck's horn beeped once, politely. Mara stood, gave a tiny wave she hoped looked braver than she felt, and walked past the post office without the pawn ticket. The kettle at home was probably still screaming. She didn't look back. The man's name was Thomas. He watched the young woman disappear around the corner, the dollar warming like a small sun against his skin. He hadn't eaten since yesterday's half-biscuit at the shelter in Burlington, but the weight in his hand felt like more than food. He stood, knees creaking, and crossed the street to Dot's. The bell above the door chimed the same cheerful note it had chimed for 30 years. Dot herself, silver bun and flour-dusted apron, looked up from the grill. "Morning, stranger. Coffee's on the house, if you're just looking to get warm." Thomas shook his head. "I've got $1, he said, voice gravel, "but I'd like to pay for the next person who looks like they need it more." Dot's eyebrows lifted. She nodded once, the way people do when something quietly sacred passes between them. She poured coffee into a paper cup, added 2 sugars without asking, and slid it across the counter. "Then let's start a tab." By noon, the cup had refilled 6 times, each refill paid forward by the last recipient. A teenager who'd forgotten her wallet, an elderly man mourning his wife's first empty chair at breakfast, a young mother juggling twins and tears. The dollar had become 5, then 10, then 23. Dot quietly tucked each new contribution into an old pickle jar labeled, "For whoever needs kindness next." She didn't announce it. She just let the jar sit by the register like a heartbeat. Somewhere, between the 3rd refill and the 4th, Thomas noticed a flyer taped to the window. Part-time handyman needed Cedar Falls Community Center, flexible hours. He jotted the number on a napkin, pocketed it, and smiled for the first time in months. Meanwhile, Mara walked home slower than she'd come. The locket was still on the counter, but its weight felt different now, less like failure, more like possibility. She made tea without sugar, wrapped herself in her grandmother's afghan, and stared out at the maple just beginning to bud. A soft knock startled her. On the porch stood Mrs. Jenkins, holding a foil-covered plate. "Heard you might need cheering," the older woman said. Inside were 3 cinnamon rolls, still warm from her oven. Mara's throat tightened. She hadn't told anyone about the $1. She hadn't told anyone about the rent. But somehow, kindness had found her anyway. 3 days later, the Cedar Falls Gazette ran a small story on page 3. Mystery Dollar Sparks chain of goodwill at Dot's Diner. The reporter hadn't known Mara's name, only that a young woman in a navy coat had started something beautiful with the smallest of offerings. The article ended with Dot's invitation. "If you're the one who gave that $1, come back. Coffee's on us for life." Readers clipped the story, taped it to refrigerators, mailed copies to grandchildren in other states. Someone posted it on Facebook. By evening, the post had 0 shares. Hashtags bloomed: small town kindness, $1 hope, feel good moment. Senior centers printed it for bulletin boards. Churches read it during announcements. A librarian in Oregon added it to her Tuesday Storytime craft hour. Each child decorated a paper dollar to pay forward. Mara saw the article late that night on her neighbor's borrowed laptop. Her hands hovered over the keyboard, unsure whether to laugh or cry. She hadn't expected anyone to notice. She certainly hadn't expected the world to care. The next morning, a letter arrived, no return address, thick cream paper. Inside was a single brass key and a note in careful handwriting. "For the locket. May it unlock more than memories." Mara turned the key over. It fit the tiny clasp perfectly. When she opened the locket, instead of the faded photograph she expected, there was a new one. Her grandmother at 20, standing outside that very diner, smiling beside a young Dot in her first apron. On the back, in her grandmother's script, "Kindness always circles home." The twist came quietly. Thomas, now sweeping floors at the community center, recognized the locket in the newspaper photo. He'd seen it on Mara's porch the morning she gave him the $1. He hadn't known it was hers then. He'd simply noticed it glinting in the sunlight. Later, when he'd gone to thank her, the porch was empty. So he'd left the key he'd found in the center's lost and found years ago, never guessing it belonged to the locket or to her. Some gifts, it seems, are simply meant to find their way back. A week later, Dot's Diner hosted a pay-it-forward pancake breakfast. Thomas flipped flapjacks, wearing a new apron that read, "Griddle of Hope." Mara stood beside him, refilling coffee, laughing at his lopsided pancake hearts. The pickle jar on the counter had grown to 4 jars, each labeled with a different local charity. The mayor, who used to be the mail carrier who'd honked that first morning, declared the first Saturday of every April $1 Day. Schools collected coins for food banks. Nursing homes exchanged dollar bills for handwritten notes of encouragement. Children taped dollars to park benches with messages, "For the next person who needs to believe." Mid-story, pause soft, almost a whisper. "What would you do with your last $1? Drop a thought, or even a single emoji below. We read every single one." The community center held a small gathering one rainy Thursday. Thomas told his story how addiction and loss had carried him far from his own grandchildren. How Mara's $1 reminded him he was still worth something. Mara spoke too, voice trembling. "I thought I had nothing left to give. Turns out, giving was the only way I found. I still had everything." In the audience, Mrs. Jenkins dabbed her eyes with the same tissue she'd used during last year's Christmas concert. The diner bell rang from someone's phone ringtone, and everyone laughed through tears. The final scene unfolded at dawn, 6 months later. The maple outside Mara's porch was full and green. She sat in her grandmother's rocking chair, sipping coffee from a mug that read, "Dots Regular." A familiar figure climbed the steps, Thomas, now wearing a flannel shirt instead of a too-thin coat. In his hand was a small envelope. Inside, a bus ticket to Burlington and a photograph of 2 smiling children waving from a porch. "They want to meet the lady who gave their grandpa a second chance," he said, voice thick. Mara's eyes filled. She hugged him, and the locket pressed between them like a tiny heartbeat. And now, dear viewer, one last invitation. What would you do with your last dollar? Tell us your kind story in the comments. Your words might become our next episode. If this touched you, subscribe to The Kind Story, tap like, and share it with someone who needs this moment.